When Winston Churchill appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace in May 1945, he had just led Great Britain through the greatest war in history. But at no time did he fear more for its outcome than during the Battle of the Atlantic, when the U-boat campaign came perilously close to strangling the lifeblood of the nation. A few days later, Londoners lined the embankment as a captured U-boat sailed up the Thames. For many in the crowd, it represented the submarine menace that had nearly defeated Great Britain twice within a generation. It was the desire of Kaiser Wilhelm II to see the German Navy transformed into a mighty fleet, able to challenge Great Britain as the world's greatest naval power, that served as a major factor to the outbreak of war in 1914. It was Admiral von Tirpitz who, as the architect of this high seas fleet, designed it to deter any of Germany's rivals from going to war with it, but failed monumentally. The staggering investment by Germany in naval power before 1914 was seen by Great Britain as a direct threat to her vital interests, especially as the main German fleet ships, such as the König-class battleship, seen being launched here in 1912, had range enough only for combat in the North Sea. Amid the launchings of a mass of vessels, investment in the new torpedo-armed submarine was not great. Indeed, when war broke out in 1914, Germany possessed just 29 U-boats. This was smaller than the numbers serving with the French or Royal Navies. It was to be the facts of Germany's highly unfavourable geopolitical position in the face of a distant blockade and the high seas fleet's inability to break the Royal Navy's stranglehold in the North Sea that would force a turn to the U-boat as the only naval weapon possessed by Germany that could neutralise her greatest enemy. It was ironic, therefore, when it was this Cinderella branch of the Navy that brought forth Germany's first publicly acclaimed war hero in the person of Kapitän-Leutnant Otto Weddigen. Indeed, his exploit was such as to call forth the need for German filmmakers to reconstruct the events that led to his rise to national prominence in one of the first propaganda films to emerge in Germany in 1914 and be shown in cinemas all over the nation to boost support for the war effort. As such, it was to prefigure the media attention paid to Admiral Dönitz's Grey Wolves in the Second Great War, in which German submariners were to play such a vital role a generation later. When war broke out in August 1914, the first naval moves employing submarines were tentative, reflecting the uncertainty either side still felt about the employment of this new underwater weapon and the fragility of these early submarines. Weddigen, who commanded U-9, a small U-boat built in 1910, was sent forth with 9 other boats into the North Sea. Their task was to ascertain the position of British fleet units. To that end, they were instructed to proceed northward to the Norway-Orkneys line, which was the most distant objective that these boats had yet been sent. Weddigen's U-9 broke down on the second day of the sortie. Other units, however, reached the objective. One boat, U-15, was spotted on the surface by the cruiser HMS Birmingham and was rammed and sunk. When the survivors returned to port, it was discovered that U-13 had also been lost. On the face of it, this initial U-boat mission was seen to be a failure, with 2 valuable boats lost. However, the British noted that these submarines had been operating much further from their bases than was thought possible. They also deduced, in the light of the ramming of U-15, that surface vessels had little to fear from these submarines. It was this belief that Weddigen was so soon to disabuse in his next cruise. Weddigen set forth on his second sortie into the North Sea some weeks later. On the 22nd of September, while running on the surface, he spotted the smoke of 3 warships. Submerging his vessel, he approached them and identified them as 3 12,000-ton British armoured cruisers, the Aboukir, Cressy and Hague. Weddigen approached each vessel in turn and torpedoed them. One after the other they went to the bottom. Few survived as 1,100 men went down with their vessels. Other captains were later feted by the press. Max Valentina, commander of U-38, acquired a reputation for killing. Von Arnaud de la Pierre was the highest-scoring U-boat ace in either war. After the Battle of Jutland in 1916 and the failure of the High Seas Fleet to defeat the Royal Navy in the North Sea, the Germans decided that only an assault on the sea lanes providing for Britain's economic existence could bring that power to her knees. For the next 2 years, there was a sustained assault on the merchant ships bringing goods to Britain's shores. Losses were phenomenal. In the first 4 months of 1917, 1.25 million tons of shipping were sunk. This figure rose by a further 1.5 million tons in the next 4 months. Such losses were bleeding white Britain's merchant marine. Her shipbuilding capacity, although large, could not cover such losses. Almost all merchant ships sailed alone, and opposition to the introduction of the convoy system by the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Jellicoe, allowed such losses to continue. It was only in the last 4 months of 1917 that convoying was extensively introduced, and a corresponding reduction in merchant shipping losses was achieved. U-boats were now forced to come to the convoys to find victims and confront the escorts. In consequence, the graph of U-boat losses now began to climb, and in 1917-18, the Germans lost a total of 150 subs and their crews, a rate they could not sustain. With the routes across the Atlantic now more secure, the tempo of American supplies and troops began to increase, and by June 1918, the convoy system had won the long battle with the U-boats. With the submarine campaign brought to an inglorious end, Germany had effectively lost the war, even though fighting continued until November. The price of victory in the Atlantic and around the coast of Britain had been very high, and the U-boats had, indeed, come close to starving England into submission. Under the terms of the armistice with Germany, which came into effect on the 11th of November 1918, the German Navy was ordered to hand over 176 U-boats to the Allies at Kiel. By December the 1st, 122 had arrived at Harwich to be divided up among the Allied powers. Many went straight to the breakers' yards. However, a number ended their days serving in the navies of their former enemies. While Germany outwardly abided by the Versailles Treaty, behind the permitted naval construction seen here, secret steps were taken to retain expertise in the building of U-boats, and in 1922 a cover Dutch company was set up to actually build submarines for foreign governments. By 1927 the Navy had a secret U-boat technical section, and by the 1930s all was in place to permit the rebuilding of a submarine arm if the political will appeared. It did so with the coming to power of Adolf Hitler in 1933, who fully supported the Navy's senior officer Gross Admiral Erich Raeder in his quest for a new German Navy and a world fleet. Raeder discovered early on that Hitler was not keen on allowing a rapid growth of the Navy for fear of once again alienating Britain. Hitler actually wished to avoid conflict with England and was for this reason happy to enter a naval agreement with her in 1935. This fulfilled two requirements. It allowed Germany to rebuild its navy and launch new ships, but only to 35% of the Royal Navy's total strength. By this means, Hitler hoped to prevent the political alienation of England. Significantly, the Germans were permitted to build the same number of U-boats as the Royal Navy. However, the naval staffs of both nations focused on the building of heavy surface vessels, as these were still seen, despite the lessons of 1914-18, to be the heart of a modern navy. Raeder, however, saw the agreement as merely provisional, and his plans for a massive expansion of the new Kriegsmarine, far beyond the agreed limit of the treaty, remained his ambition. From 1935 onwards, and in spite of the delays in the shipyards, Hitler was also wedded to the production of large warships, and was a battleship man after Raeder's own heart. It was in 1939 that Raeder presented to Hitler the final crystallization of his ambition for the Navy in the form of the Z Plan, which envisaged a fleet in which the battleship remained king. This unrealistic blueprint required the Navy to possess 10 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 4 armoured ships, 5 heavy cruisers, 68 destroyers and 249 U-boats, with a completion date of 1948 at the latest. With such a navy, Raeder assured Hitler that England could be defeated, and possibly even America as well. Eleven days after the naval agreement, the first U-boat since 1918 was commissioned at Kiel. In September 1935, Hitler appointed Karl Dönitz as Führer der U-boat. Like many who had served in the submarine arm in the Great War, Dönitz remained convinced as to the military effectiveness of the underwater craft. There is little doubt that he supported the Nazis and willingly followed Hitler in a career that would take him not just to commander of the Navy, but to Hitler's chosen replacement as Führer of the German people in 1945. Dönitz emerged as a single-minded and vocal champion of the U-boat arm. He strove to hone his young fleet into a highly effective fighting force in the years before the war. Great War U-boat operations led him to identify 2 requirements that must underpin future submarine strategy. The first was tonnage warfare, i.e. sink 750,000 tons of British shipping every month for a year, then England must surrender. Secondly, employ submarine wolf packs against the convoys. Of the submarines in service in 1939, the Type II weighed in at just 250 tons. Although Dönitz intended them as training vessels, the early onset of the war saw them employed extensively in combat. Seen here are the many variants of the 626-ton Type 7 U-boat, which was the most numerous class of submarine built in the war, with over 600 of the C model completed, although obsolete by war's end. The final design was the Type 9 and, at just over 1,000 tons, was more akin to the class of submarine operated by the British and American navies and was built in 5 versions, and they were not liked by their crews, who called them sea cows. When in mid to late August 30 U-boats were dispatched to the Atlantic and North Sea, neither Raeder nor Dönitz saw their deployment as preparations for a new conflict. Reassured by Hitler, neither believed England would go to war in 1939. The opening salvos of the German attack on Poland were fired by guns of the oldest major warship serving with any of the navies of the great powers. As one of 3 large warships permitted Germany by the Versailles Treaty, the Schleswig-Holstein had been extensively rebuilt, even though she was constructed before 1906. As the mobile forces of the Wehrmacht tore into Poland under an air umbrella provided by the new Luftwaffe, the political consequences of Hitler's decision to invade his eastern neighbour followed, with Great Britain's declaration of war on Germany on the 3rd of September. A shocked Admiral Raeder believed that war would not come until 1944, by which time he would have possessed far more ships. Also, a stunned Dönitz announced that "We have today a weapon and a leadership that can face up to this enemy. The war will last a long time, but if each does his duty, we shall win." When the radio message flashed out the news of the outbreak of hostilities, Dönitz had 18 Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats on station in the Atlantic. These were deployed from the northwest coast of Ireland through to the Azores. All carried the internationally agreed prize rules governing the sinking of ships. The actions of the captain of U-30 suggested, however, that Germany was prepared to flout them even from the outset of this new war. Commanding a Type 7 U-boat was Lieutenant Fritz Lemp, who was patrolling an area some 250 miles northwest of Ireland when, on the evening of the 3rd, he spotted a large vessel on a zigzag course heading westward off the normal shipping lanes. Lemp explained his actions by claiming that the vessel was an armed merchantman. He launched 2 torpedoes at the ship at 2100 hours, both of which hit. His victim was, in fact, a liner, the Athenia, outbound from Liverpool and carrying 1,100 passengers, of whom 112 were lost, 28 being American. The British claimed that this sinking showed that Germany had determined from the outset to engage in unrestricted U-boat warfare. The opportunist sinking of the aircraft carrier HMS Courageous in the western approaches on September the 17th, with 518 of her crew by U-29, was embraced by Goebbels' propaganda department with altogether more enthusiasm than Lemp's action. Dönitz described the dispatch of one of the Royal Navy's prize vessels as a glorious success and saw it as confirming evidence that British U-boat countermeasures were not as effective as believed. Much was made of the submarine's captain as Otto Schuhart emerged as the first of many U-boat commanders to be lauded by the German press as a grey wolf. Schuhart had been in the Navy for just 10 years and had taken command of the U-29, a Type 7 submarine, just before the onset of hostilities. The U-boat would sink a further 16 ships in addition to the Glorious, with Schuhart being awarded the Knight's Cross on the 16th of May 1940. This victory provided the U-boat arm with a tremendous fillip, and the high morale of the officers and men was clear for all to see when Hitler visited a U-boat headquarters at Wilhelmshaven on September the 28th. Dönitz was keen for Hitler to personally meet and speak with his young charges. The evident enthusiasm and appreciation of the Führer for the performance of the submariners was Dönitz's chance to present his argument to Hitler that, with 300 boats, he believed the U-boat arm could achieve decisive success over England. As the site of the internment and subsequent scuttling of the mass of the German High Seas Fleet in 1919 following the end of the Great War, Scapa Flow exercised a powerful hold on the minds of the Kriegsmarine. Dönitz had for some time been contemplating an attack on the base which, as in 1914-18, was being employed by the Royal Navy as a major fleet anchorage. In casting around for an able submarine commander in which to entrust the mission, he settled on Kapitän-Leutnant Günther Prien. Dönitz believed he possessed all the professional qualities and abilities required. U-47 slipped out of Wilhelmshaven on the 8th of October. Entering the difficult channel into Scapa Flow undetected on the evening of the 13th, Prien fired 2 separate salvos of torpedoes at HMS Royal Oak. Displacing some 33,000 tons, the battleship had been commissioned in 1916 and, although had been modernized in the 20s, was unable to withstand such an attack, and the ship sank, taking with her 330 crewmen. Prien and his crew returned to a rapturous reception. Hitler was said to be beside himself with joy at the news and immediately promoted Dönitz to Commander-in-Chief of the U-boat arm. From the earliest days of the conflict, newsreel cameramen often caught an aspect of Dönitz's behaviour that endeared him to many of his men throughout the U-boat war, and which many of its survivors still comment upon to this day. Whatever his limitations, a lack of leadership charisma was not among them. Until he became Gross Admiral and based in Berlin, he always attempted to be present at the return and departure of one of his submarines, firstly in Germany and, after June 1940, in France. Awards were frequently presented on the spot, Dönitz being of the opinion that this contributed greatly to morale. He also made it a point to be present at every passing out parade. His practice of shaking the hands of each man, lingering a short while, and looking straight into his eyes is often commented upon by veterans. Their reference to Dönitz as the Lion or Uncle Carl is the measure of their high regard for him. By year's end, his U-boats had sunk a total of 114 vessels, amounting to some 421,000 tons at a cost of 9 U-boats. 7 of these, comprising 3 Type 9As, 1 Type 7A, 1 7B and 2 Type 2Bs, have been sunk by the end of October, with U-35 and U-36, both 7As, being lost in November and December. The winter of 1939-40 was extremely cold, the sea around Wilhelmshaven and Kiel being heavily iced, with passages for returning U-boats having to be created by destroyers. When U-48 passed the Fair Island Channel on the 19th of December 1939 on its return passage, there were no U-boats at all operating in the Atlantic. Such was the consequence of a production program that had only manufactured enough new boats to replace those lost since September. This was allied to a chaotic dockyard system which took too long to repair and return vessels to service. The exceptional weather caused the delay in the dispatch of boats for training and combat patrols during January. In the meantime, the newsreel had caught the return of U-48 after a successful cruise. Admiral Dönitz was, as usual, on hand to welcome the crew home, talk with them about their experiences and present awards. Many men are seen receiving the Iron Cross, and this film clearly shows the manner in which Dönitz related to his men. Awarded the Knight's Cross some months later in March 1940 for his successful command of U-48 was Herbert Schulze. During its first 4 cruises under Schulze, U-48 sank 16 ships, amounting to some 109,074 tons. His final tally was 28 vessels, and he survived the war. Hitler's decision to forestall any Anglo-French attempt to interrupt the vital shipment of iron ore to Germany through the ice-free port of Narvik in northern Norway led to a commitment of the bulk of the Kriegsmarine surface fleet to Operation Weserübung in April 1940. Denmark capitulated within 24 hours of the beginning of operations on the 9th of April, but German moves on Norway prompted a major response from the Royal Navy. Integral to the German naval plan was the involvement of all serviceable U-boats to support the surface elements. The need for submarines for the Norwegian operation led to the cancellation of U-boat operations in the Atlantic. For the period of the campaign, they were to forego attacks on ordinary shipping and concentrate on the defence of the Norwegian area and attacks on enemy warships and transports. Their subsequent performance in the intense naval operations amid the fjords were deemed by the Germans themselves to have been a failure. Post-battle analysis pointed the finger of blame not at U-boat commanders nor with their tactics, but to the inadequacy of the torpedoes, the spectacular record of failure of which now led to a crisis within the U-boat arm. Commanders described how torpedoes exploded prematurely or not at all, so that many attacks on enemy warships came to nothing. The subsequent discovery that torpedoes, whether fitted with contact or magnetic pistols, did not function properly in northern waters meant that to all intents and purposes the U-boats were without a weapon. Months would elapse before these problems were solved. The unfolding events of May and June 1940, when German ground and air forces occupied the Low Countries and vanquished the Anglo-French armies, was watched with rapt attention by the U-boat High Command. With the fall of Paris and the signing of the French surrender on June the 21st, Dönitz and his colleagues realized that the naval war had now been transformed. At one fell swoop, the strategic situation of Germany at sea had been revolutionized by the delivery into German hands of the ports along the Bay of Biscay and their direct access to the Atlantic and the vital arterial sea lanes on which Great Britain depended for her existence. In anticipation of such an outcome, U-boat Command had a train waiting and equipped with torpedoes and personnel necessary for the maintenance of U-boats, which was dispatched to the Biscay area within 24 hours of the surrender. Although the Germans were denied access to the French Navy under the terms of the surrender, its mothballing robbed the Royal Navy of many French vessels which it had been able to use in the vital task of convoy protection. Dönitz was therefore not exaggerating when he described the changed strategic situation as of the greatest possible significance to the U-boat campaign. While his leader basked in the adulation of his people during the Great Victory Parade in Berlin, Dönitz was gearing up his men for a long war, for he did not believe Britain would surrender or be invaded. In practical terms, basing submarines on the Biscay coast saves some 450 miles on the northern convoy route from Wilhelmshaven or Kiel. More important for Dönitz, however, was the time saved in the coverage of that distance. A week was saved, resulting in a raising of the number of U-boats available for the operational area in the Atlantic by as much as 25% per month. On July the 7th, Captain Lieutenant Fritz Lemp sailed U-30 into the port of Lorient on the southern coast of Brittany to become the first German submarine to employ the facilities of this former French naval base. This port was to become one of the primary bases from which many U-boats would sortie into the Atlantic in the months and years to come. Arriving shortly thereafter was submarine UA, originally built for Turkey and taken over by the Kriegsmarine. At the quayside to greet both returning crews was Dönitz, who was shortly to move his U-boat headquarters from Wilhelmshaven to Lorient. He greatly approved of the facilities of the base, observing that they were superior to those of the overburdened yards in Germany. At first, the facilities were used to resupply and rearm the U-boats. G7 torpedoes, manufactured and then delivered by rail from Germany to Lorient, are being loaded onto a U-boat soon to depart on a new cruise. The primary disadvantage of Lorient and of the other bases that came online later in the year was their close proximity to England, as they were well within range of RAF bombers. Indeed, it was Hitler who first broached the subject of providing the new U-boat bases with permanent protection later in 1940 and authorized the construction of the great concrete pens that were to become so much a feature in the Biscay bases by 1943. Shortly after his arrival with U-30, Lemp was transferred to take command of the U-110, a longer-ranging Type 9B U-boat. It was while in command of this submarine that he was killed when the vessel was forced to surface by two Royal Naval destroyers when attacking convoy OB-318 off the Azores in May 1941. If for the British the second half of 1940 was to witness a major hemorrhage in shipping losses, then it was their perception that it was not just the U-boats that were responsible. Casting a great shadow over the sea lanes was the Focke-Wulf Condor, a former airliner built before the war for Deutsche Lufthansa and modified to serve as a long-range patrol aircraft over water. Although carrying a relatively small bomb load, the heavy onboard armament and long range of the machine allowed Condors to fly far out to sea, way beyond the ability of the RAF, to offer air protection to merchant ships, which subsequently became easy prey for this four-engine Predator. The very small numbers of Condors available equipped the first Staffel of Kampfgeschwader 40 based at Bordeaux, from which they began operations in June 1940. Nevertheless, the rising number of ships sunk by Condors from June onwards led Churchill to describe the aircraft as the scourge of the Atlantic. While Dönitz was pleased that these aircraft were proving so successful, the Condors nevertheless symbolized for him a fundamental problem facing his ability to direct the operations of his U-boats in the location of convoys. In clear visibility, which was somewhat rare in the North Atlantic, the smoke of merchantmen could be seen from the conning tower of a U-boat up to 50 miles away. But on most days there was a heavy swell and visibility was poor, leading to convoys slipping past. Ever since 1938, Dönitz had been pressing for the Navy to possess its own long-range reconnaissance aircraft that could be employed to work as spotters for his submarines. Hermann Goering, as head of the Luftwaffe, had set his face totally against such a proposal. Even with the introduction of the Condor over the Atlantic, Dönitz could not direct the operations of KG-40. In December, he had reported that KG-40 was independent and cooperation with the formation was only due to personal contact and that just one Condor was available daily. When, in January 1941, Hitler sanctioned the subordination of one KG-40 to Dönitz to provide reconnaissance for U-boats, Goering tried vigorously to get him to give them up. For Goering, denying the Navy an air arm was more important than aiding the U-boat war. As it was, the Condor U-boat relationship ultimately proved a failure. It is hardly surprising that the period between June and October 1940, during which the U-boats carried out a veritable slaughter of merchant shipping en route to the United Kingdom, corresponded to that nation's moment of greatest peril. In the face of the imminent threat of invasion of the home island, virtually all air and naval assets were pulled back to lend assistance to those already tasked with opposing a German seaborne landing from across the Channel. The upshot being that shipping, whether in convoy or sailing alone, did so virtually without protection. Furthermore, other French bases such as Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice and Bordeaux came on stream as U-boat bases, allowing more submarines to feed in directly to the Atlantic shipping lanes. This culmination of factors in favour of Dönitz boats became all too apparent in this period, so that it was subsequently referred to by the U-boat commanders as the first of the happy times. For the loss of 6 of their own number, the U-boat sank 275 vessels. The worst month for the British was June, where, in addition to the 58 ships sunk by submarine, a further 22 were dispatched by the Luftwaffe, a total amounting to 479,000 tons. Using wolf-pack tactics employing multiple U-boats, the submarines attacked on the surface and in darkness. On the night of the 21st of September, U-boat numbers 99, 65, 48, 46 and 43 attacked convoy HX-72 by this method and sank 11 vessels. On the 19th of October, employing these same methods, convoy HX-79 was attacked and 12 ships sunk. One Royal Navy captain observed of the U-boats how, thanks to their low silhouette, they are almost undetectable in the dark. Because of their small size, they can avoid collisions or speedily disappear under the waves if spotted by escort ships. Our ASDIC is virtually useless against this mode of attack, and we are almost powerless under such conditions. For Dönitz, such actions and such successes provided grim verification of the techniques developed since 1935 in training U-boats to attack convoys employing pack tactics. The emergence of a rash of highly successful submarine captains was exploited to the full, with their faces being splashed across the newspapers and the newsreels. Joachim Schepke, commander of U-100, who had sunk a grand total of 35 ships by March 1941 when he met his death. Wilhelm Lieber, who sank 32 ships totaling 168,000 tons as commander of U-38 through to June 1941. Best known of the Grey Wolves at this time because of his Scapa Flow exploit was Günther Prien. If June 1940 recorded the highest monthly shipping loss of the war, with 284,000 tons sunk, Prien accounted for 66,587 tons. Returning to Lorient is U-99 and the mount of Korvettenkapitan Otto Kretschmer, the one-shot ace who was Germany's most successful U-boat commander of the war, with a final tonnage tally of 314,000 tons. He took command of U-99 in April 1940, after 9 cruises in U-23, in which he had sunk 9 vessels. In the 3 months from June 1940, Kretschmer carved out a name for himself, and when awarded the Knight's Cross on August the 4th, he'd sunk 117,000 tons of shipping. It was against this desperate backdrop of sinkings that President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act, permitting the export of large amounts of war material to Britain to aid her fight against Germany. While the USA was neutral, Roosevelt was mindful to extend to Britain all aid short of war to ensure her survival. Churchill openly admitted to the US president that he was facing a catastrophe at sea and needed to obtain additional escort vessels to protect the convoys. In a deft political move that sidestepped his critics in Congress, Roosevelt granted Churchill's request and exchanged 50 World War I four-stacker destroyers for leased bases in British territories overseas. Although on paper the transfer of these 50 destroyers provided the Royal Navy with a vital infusion of escort vessels, in practice they left much to be desired. Renamed the Town class, these 4-funnelled vessels were to render sterling service. Capable of high speeds, they were loathed by the crews fated to serve in them. They were narrow, rolled viciously, and were difficult to handle. Nevertheless, most of them performed well, and they filled a critical gap in the Royal Navy's defences during a time of desperate need. The Sunderland flying boat, which along with the American-built Hudson patrol bomber was the only truly modern type operated by RAF Coastal Command in 1939 and was by 1941 available in far more numbers. With a maximum range of 2,900 miles, the Sunderland was the only type that could fly far out to sea over the convoy routes. It was a vital weapon in the fight against the U-boat. By 1941, it had been joined by 30 examples of the US-supplied consolidated PBY-5 Catalina flying boat. Although slower than the Sunderland, its range was greater, allowing it to stay on station and shadow convoys for long periods. When carrying depth bombs, it was used to attack U-boats. Unbeknown to the Germans, the British had achieved a major intelligence coup when they retrieved a working Enigma decoding machine from Lemp's sinking U-110 in May 1941. Sent to the Special Intelligence Service station at Bletchley Park in England, the codes were broken by the end of May. Deciphered signals sent by U-boat command to their ships in the Atlantic were thus being read, in consequence of which the Admiralty rerouted convoys to avoid U-boats. A radical improvement in other measures in the first half of 1941 saw major successes against the U-boats. Increases in escort numbers, improved techniques and surface radar all came together in this period, and many U-boat aces became their victims. Shepka perished on the 17th of March when the destroyers Vannock and Walker killed U-100 after a long pursuit, Vannock ramming the surfaced submarine. In consequence of these more effective defensive measures by the Royal Navy, the U-boats found their areas of operations being forced further westwards and out into the Atlantic. Possibly the most famous victim of the new escort techniques was Gunter Prien. On the 6th of March, Prien attacked convoy OB-293. Denied success, he nevertheless maintained contact. On the 8th, he fired again, but was depth-bombed. U-47 never resurfaced. Prien was killed. A week later, Kretschmer was captured after U-99 was brought to the surface when attacking convoy number HX-112. He and his crew were forced to abandon ship, and he spent the rest of the war as a POW in Canada. The extensive film taken by this newsreel cameraman when part of the crew of U-46 in the Atlantic in the second half of 1941 gives us a real insight into the routine and way of life aboard a U-boat. As part of the 7th U-boat flotilla based at the Biscay port of Saint-Nazaire, U-46 was under the command of Engelbert Endras, a noted U-boat ace. At this stage of the war, it was still possible for U-boats to cross the Bay of Biscay without attack from British aircraft, although by 1942 and 1943, the chances of traversing this area of sea without attracting a roving Sunderland was increasingly problematic. Nor would the scene of one U-boat passing another, one homeward and the other outward bound, occur very often in the future. Clearly seen on the conning tower of U-46 is the charging bull emblem which Endras had adopted from Prien's U-47. Having spotted smoke on the horizon, the alarm is given and the submarine prepares to crash dive. Watch crew comes tumbling down the interior of the conning tower, with the last being Endras himself. As soon as the submarine begins to dive, crewmen move to engage the electric motors as the two diesel engines used to propel the submarine on the surface are closed down. Fed by large accumulators, the electric motors allowed the submerged craft to move underwater at a maximum speed of 7 knots. It was the fact of this low underwater speed that led to attacks on convoys, which frequently moved at a slightly faster pace, being made at night when the U-boat could travel unseen at some 17 knots on the surface. It was also this low underwater speed which permitted British escorts, which could move more quickly on the surface, to hunt down U-boats underwater once their numbers and effectiveness increased from 1941 onwards. While running just below the surface, Endras orders the periscope raised to view the location of the enemy vessel. In the absence of enemy escorts, Endras has chosen to dispatch this merchantman by gunfire. The gun crew pull out the shells for the 88mm gun, which is stored in a waterproof locker under the foredeck. Normally, the gun would be used to finish off a vessel that had first been damaged by torpedoes. This, if possible, was the preferred method, as torpedoes were valuable weapons and were to be preserved where possible. Exhaustion of the torpedo complement normally required a return to port. This was to a certain extent alleviated by supply ships and later Milch-Cow supply submarines. This merchantman is itself armed and is firing back at the U-boat. The final outcome is not in doubt, and a number of hits from the 88 along the waterline of the vessel seal its fate, and it sinks to a watery grave. The two six-cylinder 1400 HP diesel engines used four-stroke oil drawn from the external hull tanks that gave the Type 7 its distinctive bulged hull. While Endras and his number 1 plot the distance to the next target, whose coordinates would have been received in code and decoded on the unseen Enigma machine, the alarm bell sounds as all activities are abandoned and the whole crew is called to action stations. The electric motors are again turned on as U-46 crash dives. The submarine now makes for the area given by the coordinates where a convoy has been spotted. Endras surveys the horizon, the convoy is seen in the distance. A target is selected.
Der größte Dampfer wird aufs Korn genommen. Das Boot geht in Schussposition.
The torpedoes are now loaded, the order is given to fire, and the first of the fish is away.
Die Laufzeit des Torpedos wird mit der Stoppuhr verfolgt.
A cry goes up as a hit is registered, the detonation being clearly heard underwater. Endras surveys the now blazing vessel, and shortly thereafter another merchantman sinks beneath the waves. Endras was a practiced sinker of merchantmen. His final tally of ships sunk amounted to 142,000 tons, and he was an early recipient of the Knight's Cross, having been awarded the medal in September 1940. On this occasion, however, the U-boat is detected, either due to the wake of its periscope having been spotted, or it has been picked up by ASDIC, or both. An enemy escort vessel is bearing down on the submarine, and the cry goes out to prepare for depth charging. The boat now goes into a steep dive in the hope of getting below the preset depth at which the charges are primed to explode. The pressure of water increases rapidly as it goes deeper, and at 150 meters it is possible to cause serious cracks in the pressure hull, leading to an inflow of water into the vessel. The exploding depth charges shake the U-boat as it continues its plunge. The crew watch the depth gauges anxiously. A close detonation causes the electric lights to flicker. The crew now turn to deal with the water that is starting to leak through a number of valves into the command area. The inflow is secured. The submarine now returns to periscope depth. On occasions, the persistence of British U-boat hunters caused submarines to stay submerged for a very long time. Endras now orders his U-boat to the surface. With the onset of sunset and the imminence of bad weather, the bridge crew dons waterproofs in order to stand watch. Weather conditions in the Atlantic were often very poor and visibility low. Spotting enemy vessels under such conditions was difficult, the conning tower of a U-boat not offering an exceptionally high vantage point for observation purposes. Down below, crewmen take the opportunity to sleep. Due to the very cramped size of the U-boat, sleeping conditions were primitive, with hot bunking the norm. One crewman coming off duty would sleep on the same bunk as another who had just gone on duty. Even the sleeping conditions for the officers was extremely cramped. For the torpedo crew, maintenance of their charges was an important and regular part of their onboard duties. Known as eels, the torpedoes were withdrawn from their tubes every 4 or 5 days for maintenance. The captain, who was himself catching some sleep, is woken to attend a crewman who's damaged his arm. With all the many projections and rough and tumble of life in such a confined space, minor injuries were a common problem on U-boats. This patient is helped by a glass of medicinal schnapps or liberated whiskey. Endras takes advantage and has one himself.
Auch hierbei hilft der Kommandant. Zum 50. Male dieselbe Platte und immer noch keine Rauchfahne.
Zapfenstreich, es kann 3 Tage kosten, Kamerad, ich komm ja gleich. Das sagten wir.
Das einzig Erfreuliche.
Wie gerne sich mit dir gehen, mit dir, Lili Marleen.
Die Freiwache spielt Dauerschach.
On the bridge, the morning watch are searching the horizon for vessels as the U-boat plunges through a heavy Atlantic swell. Smoke is now spotted on the horizon. After a short discussion among the watch crew, the alarm is given. The bell rings throughout the ship as the crew is signalled to prepare for diving. Those asleep in their bunks roll out and run through the narrow passage of the U-boat to their duty stations. Lili Marleen is forgotten as the well-rehearsed and tried routine of action stations goes into play.
Das Boot geht auf Seerohrtiefe.
Loten! Loten!
The whole process of launching is repeated.
Rohr 2 los!
On a later cruise in 1941, Endras took command of U-567, a Type 7C in which he was involved in a running battle with the escorts of convoy HG-76 in the week before Christmas. For 5 days, Endras and a host of other U-boats attacked the convoy, assisted by the Condors of KG-40. In the early hours of the 22nd of December, after a 2-hour hunt of the U-boat with Azdik, the escort sloop HMS Deptford located Endras' submarine, depth-charged her and sank her. Endras and all his crew were lost. Dönitz said that he was one of the best and one of our most experienced U-boat commanders. The appeal by Dönitz to Hitler in September 1939 that 300 U-boats be built had fallen on deaf ears. The result was that it was only in mid-1941, when the window of opportunity for U-boats had already passed, that new boats started leaving the shipyards en masse. Although numbers rose from 49 to 124 boats by May 1941, and rapidly thereafter to 236 by December, the number of operational boats had not risen until February 1941 because so many were tied up in training new crews in the Baltic. Dönitz could not hope to get Hitler to commit the economic resources to building the U-boats he needed once Germany had invaded Russia in June. Although the Führer anticipated that the Soviet Union would be defeated in short order, it followed that the massive scale of military commitment to the Eastern Campaign would see the bulk of resources allocated to service the needs of the Army and Air Force in that theatre. If the Eastern Gamble was not concluded quickly, then the U-boat arm would have to compete for the limited resources of the Reich for the production of submarines in the face of an ever-widening war. Dönitz also failed to get Admiral Raeder to convince Hitler to change his mind concerning his decision to send U-boats to the Med. On August the 26th, Dönitz had received an order from Führer headquarters ordering the redirection of 6 submarines from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean theatre, where they were to help protect the vital supply routes from Italy, servicing the German and Italian forces in North Africa. This he regarded as a fundamental change of strategy which drew resources away from the Atlantic, which he saw as the primary theatre of naval operations, in order to serve his secondary concerns. Most frustrating was that at the very time he was witnessing the first real rise in the number of U-boats available to strike a crippling blow against the Atlantic convoys, he saw the means to do so snatched from his hand and directed elsewhere. Hitler was ever anxious to prop up the position of his Italian Axis partner. It certainly was the case that the Royal Navy had been achieving remarkable success against Axis shipping in the Med. Contrary to the images displayed in this propaganda film of the Italian Navy defending a small convoy, it frequently came off the worse in encounters with British submarines and in surface engagements since Italy had entered the war in May 1940. Anxious to ensure that the Italians had no excuse to backslide from their commitments, Hitler had sent the U-boats to combat the effectiveness of the Royal Navy in the theatre. The first U-boats arrived in theatre in September and were used in the port of La Spezia on the northwestern Italian coast. Nominally under Italian Navy command, they acted independently under German control, supplementing the large but relatively ineffectual Italian submarine fleet. A high-profile victim was the Royal Naval aircraft carrier Ark Royal. A part of Force H, the Ark was steaming with the battleship Malaya when it was caught by U-boats 81 and 205 on the night of the 13th of November. Heavily torpedoed, the ship's crew did their utmost to keep her afloat, but their efforts were to prove to no avail and the vessel sank. As a result, the Royal Navy had no carriers available for operation in the Med. U-81 was heavily depth-charged during the action, but escaped after more than 180 had been dropped around her. It was Captain Lieutenant Friedrich Guggenberger who was acclaimed the victor, and on his return to La Spezia was feted by both the Italian and German press and was awarded the Knight's Cross for his actions. Also present at this award ceremony was Captain Lieutenant Hans Dietrich von Tiesenhausen, the commander of U-331. He had assumed command of this Type 7C U-boat on the 31st of March 1941 and had made one uneventful cruise in her before being dispatched to the Mediterranean. It was on the 25th of November that Tiesenhausen had encountered a large formation of British warships comprising 3 battleships and 8 destroyers off the coast of Mersa Matruh. He fired a spread of 4 torpedoes on the battleship HMS Barham, a modernised veteran of the Battle of Jutland in 1916. The Barham was caught on some of the most graphic film of the war when it capsized and exploded, taking with her 860 crew. Tiesenhausen was awarded the Knight's Cross for this exploit on the 27th of January 1942. Half a world away, the government of Imperial Japan had determined upon war with the USA and Great Britain in pursuit of her designs for a greater co-prosperity sphere in Asia. On the 7th of December 1941, Admiral Chiyoichi Nagumo launched an airstrike of over 300 aircraft against the US Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. Catching the US defenses totally by surprise, the waves of torpedo and dive bombers sank a large number of battleships. However, their main target, the US carriers, were not present. Declaring the 7th of December 1941 to be a day that will live in infamy, President Roosevelt declared war on Japan the following day. Although Hitler had strained his utmost to avoid his U-boats provoking the Americans, so as not to give them an excuse for joining the war, it was nevertheless he who now declared war on the USA, and, ominously, the grey wolves were about to be let off their leashes.